Hey, everybody. Welcome to Saturday night and another episode of All the Things. I am Monique Duson.
And I'm Krista Bontrager. And?
Also known as Theology Mom.
Also known as Theology Mom, yes.
She is also known as Theology Mom. I'll just pick that up.
Yeah.
And this is the show where we talk about all things related to God, life, and the Bible.
That's right. And helping us on the show tonight and every Saturday night, because we couldn't do the show without him, is Bob Bontrager.
Yes, hello.
He doesn't have a camera because I have the camera in the
She swiped it.
Center for Biblical Unity headquarters. Yes. Sorry about that. Upstairs? Yeah.
Okay. So we want to invite everyone to join us over at my Theology Mom YouTube channel for the live stream chat box.
Yes.
If you want to interact with us. Our guest moderators tonight are the lovely and gracious Emily Bontrager, and our friend Jeremy Webb is jumping in there tonight.
You know, I have never met Jeremy in person, but I would say he's probably lovely and gracious as well. Jeremy, I got your back. I see. Yes, lovely and gracious Jeremy Webb.
From baseball fan from Chicago.
Yes, baseball and movies.
Oh, yes.
Likes movies.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so we want to invite you to do your part of the participation tonight is share the show.
Yes, and hey to everybody in Facebook world.
Yes.
You can find us on the All the Things page, the Center for Biblical Unity page, or the Theology Mom page. And if you're there, we're also looking at comments there too. It's just a little bit more clunky than YouTube.
It is. It's a lot more clunky. So share the show. Give us a thumbs up no matter where you're watching us. Hit the like button, comment, and hit the share button. And make sure that you're subscribed on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button because YouTube, they have a little tendency sometimes to make the decision for you. And they unsubscribe people. So just make sure you're subscribed and hit that notifications bell so you'll know when we upload new content or go live.
Yes. And when we don't have our shirts on today because I guess we took a break. We've been wearing them like every episode.
I didn't want people to think that's the only thing I had.
Y'all, it is the only shirt I have almost. But I need to get the tank top. That's it. I need that in my life.
Well, see, that's what I'm saying. It's hot. It's hot for real right now.
No, it really isn't.
So,
but we do have shirts. You can get tank top or a mug, face mask, whatever you feel like you need. We are here for you. Okay?
For Monique, it's not hot until it's 110. So
that's basically true.
You can go to the centerforbiblicalunity.com/merch and check out the shirts, the tank tops,
the mugs, face masks, baby onesie, support. And then $5 from every shirt that's sold goes to help support our fund for curriculum.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the tank tops are, I don't know what they are. There's two styles.
Yes. So there's that. Now.
Okay. What are we doing?
It's your turn.
All right.
It's your turn.
It's my turn. Okay.
You guys, in case you can't tell, we don't practice all the time. Sometimes we just jump in.
Live television.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay, so let's get into it here because one of the most frequent questions that we get at the ministry is, what is systemic racism and is it real?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you've been very hesitant to say much publicly about this question.
Because it feels so convoluted. It feels like either you need to affirm that, yes, there is some, but as soon as you say yes, and people are like, I told you everything is systemic, everything, systemic racism. But then if you say, well, I don't know that I really believe that, then all of a sudden you're thrown into this other category of unbeliever. and then you don't believe and you don't support that racism is real.
Or people use it to weaponize, that as a gotcha to their friends. Like, see, I told you it's not real. It's
not
just
real.
It's all fake.
Yeah. So, people, we have never said that. I have never said that.
Yeah. But we get these letters that are like,
my friend told me you didn't believe in racism.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry that your friend didn't communicate honestly. I did not say that,
So we're going to break that down tonight with Dr. Pat Sawyer.
I call, not just for our show, but, in real life, Uncle Dr. Pat. And I'm going to go ahead. Do you want to give the history because your version of the history is a little different than mine?
All right. You give the history of your journey with Pat Sawyer and his role in your life.
So one day I received a call from someone who said that Pat Sawyer was believing in critical race theory. And I said, let me talk to him so that I can set him straight. And this is what happened. And we've been friends ever since.
I don't like your version.
No, in reality, when we were having our back and forth with the conversation of critical race theory and what is it and why do you believe this way, you didn't know what in the world I was believing.
Yeah.
You reached out to Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer.
Yeah.
And it created a relationship between us because I think you were really at your wit's end.
I was at the end of my
rope.
rope.
What in the world? Yeah. What do I do with this girl? And that opened. Pat was gracious and allowed me to have his email address, and so we started some email dialogue back and forth. And God is just really faithful, and created a relationship there where I could ask questions. And since then, it's just been a journey. It's been really, really good, and it's been a blessing. And I'm grateful for his voice. Now with the Center for Biblical Unity, we had probably 3 weeks ago now, we had a really long discussion. He just has so much wisdom and so much grace in like my questions and things like that, but still just a lot of wisdom in saying, hey, consider this, remember that. So yeah, I call him Uncle Dr. Pat in real life, and he knows this. And so, really grateful for his voice in his life.
Well, I think it's going to be good. He's going to help us do kind of a deeper dive into this whole question about systemic racism, systemic injustice, and really helping us begin to find our way through that issue, and bringing up some of the things that he's worked through with you. So let's get Dr. Pat Sawyer on the Zoom machine here. The show is not sponsored by Zoom, but we love Zoom. All right.
There he is.
Yeah,
hey, Pat.
And the pleasure's been mine in my relationship with Monique. So the universe needs to know that. So.
Yeah.
It's been great conversations. It's been encouraging. It's been a two-way street in those regards. So without question.
Thanks.
Well, maybe our viewers might know your writing and research partner, Dr. Neil Shenvi, who was on our show back in February, and we're referring people to those resources all the time, nearly daily, on our site. So, but they may not be as familiar with you, and so maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in the issue of critical theory.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I was a banker and financial service, worked in the financial services banking industry for about 20 years. And I became a believer, a Christian, just before I went to undergrad at UNC Chapel Hill and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so when I became a believer, so that means I'm an old guy, so I've been a believer for quite a while now, 3 decades. And for a lot of that time, I have been doing lay apologetics ministry and speaking at different places and doing conferences, different things. And over time, I felt like God was pressing me to get more and more officially into the arena of ideas relative to advanced degrees. And so I built a career in the banking industry. My last role, I was a senior vice president, regional director of a mid-level bank. I ran the state of Virginia and parts of North Carolina in terms of my aspect of the bank. And so that was quite a career. So it's kind of hard to pull out from that. But over time, and with a number of people around me encouraging me to step up my penetration for Christ into secular culture. So in my 40s, I decided to go get a master's concentration, and then a PhD and a PhD concentration. And I did that. My undergrad was at UNC Chapel Hill, and then I did a master's in communication studies with a concentration in liberal studies at UNC Greensboro, and then some of that at UNC Wilmington. And then I've got a PhD in cultural studies and educational studies and cultural studies with the concentration in critical philosophy. And that's also from UNC Greensboro. And then I'm a faculty member at UNC Greensboro. And so I went into the secular university from the standpoint of loving my colleagues and my students, for Christ and trying to be a genuine believer in that context. And in terms of how critical theory became part of my education life, just simply when I got the master's in communication studies, critical theory, critical social theory was part of that curriculum. And so when I chose what route I was going to go in terms of a PhD, critical theory, critical social theory is a big part of that process. And a lot of the classes and courses dovetail with various aspects of critical social theory on the education side, particularly critical pedagogy and cultural foundations. And then in my PhD is social justice and higher education in the age of neoliberalism. And so at the bottom of my conceptual framework in my dissertation is critical theory that builds up to critical pedagogy and then cultural foundations. And
so was it that you started to, as a Christian, like what kept you from just kind of going down the path of critical theory? What made you start to sit back and think, now, wait a minute, I don't know if I'm buying into this all the way, or I see some problems here between my worldview as a Christian and what I'm going through in my doctoral program?
Well, for me, I'd been a Christian for 30 years, and I cut my teeth on the Reformers and the Puritans in terms of my theological perspectives. And so, by God's grace, I mean, I'm the worst sinner you will meet, but I have been in the scriptures and in some serious theology relative to some of the best thinkers. And so, my mind coming into my master's program and my PhD program was really convinced about the veracity of the scriptures. And so the differences that present itself relative to critical theory and critical social theory were immediate to me and prominent to me. And that incompatibility was immediate. Now, I will say I didn't approach any of it from a haughty standpoint, take heed that you stand lest you fall. So I was in prayer a lot about God, protect my mind, help me to think biblically, help me to think rightly. And frankly, my faith was strengthened during the process of my master's program and my PhD program. I enjoyed reading elaborate arguments coming from the standpoints of the scholars that we approached in my program. But God very quickly was helpful to me in seeing where these ideas departed. And so in my master's program and in my PhD program, there's a range of ideas permeating. And so the areas that were strongly against biblical epistemology, I just wrote from the standpoint of polemics and winsomely. And then in areas that dovetailed with common grace in my program, I applauded those loudly and, was quick to honor where truth was being presented itself in my program.
I don't think people might have appreciation for how sophisticated that is, because you're making it sound like, well, of course, I knew the scriptures and I was interacting with the Puritans. There's a lot of well-meaning Christians who've grown up in the church who go to graduate school and do end up embracing critical theory. And I mean, I applaud you for your rigor in understanding those nuances of epistemology and common grace. I mean, those are fairly sophisticated ideas that I learned in seminary, but the average person who, may not be interacting with. And I just want to say that what you engaged in that intellectual project was fairly sophisticated as you navigated your way through that. I just want people to know that you're just saying, well, I just kind of I knew the scriptures and I was interacting with the period. Yeah, but come now. Well, that was, you're saying a lot there.
Well, I would say this, that again, I was very prayerful that God would protect my mind and I didn't have a haughty approach about it. But I did spend a lot of time in my Christian life cutting my teeth on, people like Francis Turretin and his institutes and John Calvin's institutes and John Owen's commentaries. And so, and a number of 30, 40 major theologians and their works. and being in those for years. And so when I got to a lot of postmodern philosophy, where I'd have a sentence that was 75 words and 17 commas, it wasn't the first time really that I had been over some things that had some depth. And then I would also say that, biblically speaking, all truth, if it's actually true, is God's truth, regardless of its secondary and tertiary epistemological locations. So no matter where the truth is coming from in our apparent provenance, what appears to be the epistemological location of that truth, if it is actually true, it really begins with God. Yeah. And so, I was able by God's grace to see those things. But I would also say this too, that, and to your point, Krista, when people begin to depart from a biblical worldview because of the pressures of critical theory or the seduction of critical theory and critical social theory, then they are doing that in spite of their orthodoxy. Because what's downstream from orthodoxy is not a worldview perspective of critical social theory. And so when people aren't rooted firmly in the scriptures, and I would say this is another thing, that our evangelical churches do not have nearly enough instruction on sound doctrine. The typical evangelical couldn't begin to start with the doctrine of God and walk all the way through systematic theology. They couldn't even begin to do that. In fact, we have the notion of a confession is even absent from a lot of evangelical churches. So certainly deep instruction around it. And so the best protection, I used to do apologetics quite a bit with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and I would be at churches. And one of the things that I would say, the best protection against error is truth.
Yeah.
And so you don't have to spend time learning a lot of error to understand what the truth is. But once you understand what the truth is, then you can spot error, and you don't have to spend time learning a lot of error to get the ins and outs about it, to make sure you know what you believe.
Yeah.
If you've been strongly rooted in the scriptures, then whether you understand exactly what's being said to you or not by somebody offering a heretical or erroneous position, you can still spot it.
Yeah. That's good.
All right, Uncle Dr. Pat, we're about to switch gears now a little bit.
Okay.
So you've been talking about critical theory, critical social theory. We use the terms critical theory, critical race theory, and we're really big on defining our terms. So when you say critical social theory, what are you referring to exactly?
Well, in the academy today, or really the last 30 or 40 years, the way to think about critical theory is critical social theory, CST. And in CST, critical social theory, there are a lot of critical social theories. And so critical race theory is just one of those critical social theories that is encapsulated in critical social theory.
So go ahead.
And so when we think about formal critical theory, that would refer to the Frankfurt School that began in 1923, came into its own with the directorship of Max Horkheimer in 1930. And critical theory began with the Frankfurt School as a Marxist enterprise, and then it morphed into a neo-Marxist enterprise. So it was much concerned about the means of production and labor, class struggle, and oppression rooted in class struggle. And then critical theory was also a pushback against traditional theory and the positivism of traditional theory. But that, again, of course, is the 1920s and then 30s, 40s, and 50s primarily. And the Frankfurt School moved to Geneva in 33, and then to New York and Columbia in 34, and then it moved to Los Angeles in the 1940s, and back to Frankfurt, Germany in the 1950s. And that enterprise, moving from Marxism to neo-Marxism, began to see oppression, not just from an economic standpoint or in the economy or from means of production in the labor process, but it began to see oppression across a range of places in society, all kinds of different systems and so forth, and institutions. And so oppression was being manifested in places like education or entertainment or science or law and so forth. And so the expansion of critical theory in the Frankfurt School, moving from a Marxist to a neo-Marxist perspective, when we continue on into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, now we're morphing into something that is being defined as critical social theory. At the popular level, because of people like Robin DiAngelo, and as you well know, the term that's typically used is critical social justice, but that is actually not the best term from my standpoint because it's too narrow. The Academy speaks of critical social theory with multiple critical social theories in critical social theory. And so feminist theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, critical social theory applied to education, critical race theory, critical social theory applied to race and ethnicity. And again, critical theory is about power, the analysis of power, the dissection of power, who has it, who doesn't, and why. And then it is about emancipation, emancipating those who have been left out of hegemonic or dominant society and have been marginalized and disenfranchised. And so that perspective, that telos of critical theory in its most robust forms, telos means robust and complete forms, its ultimate goals is about the dissection, interrogation of power with an emancipatory praxis and activism associated with it. And so critical race theory is just one application of that. And that is, along the lines of race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Or I think it should. We talk a lot about that on our show, the different theories that come or have been streamlined down from critical theory. So that makes a lot of sense when we call it critical social theories. So you get critical race theory, Latinx theory, feminist theory, queer theory, even
right.
like ableism and child studies, like fat studies, all of those things, right?
Right.
All right.
And things like post-colonial studies, which is looking at imperialism and colonialism and how power is manifested there. But to your point earlier, people often conflate critical theory and critical race theory. They use the terms interchangeably, and that's flawed.
Right.
Their critical race theory sits underneath the jurisdiction of critical theory, but it's wrong to conflate the two.
Now we're going to take it step by step. So we have, again, we big on defining our terms. We want to get into systemic racism, systemic injustice. But what I'm hoping you can do first is give us a clear definition of racism for people who may be joining us for like the first time or haven't seen any of our shows that talk about racism. What is the current definition of racism? And then if you can steer us into systemic racism and maybe even compare and contrast some of that for us.
Sure. Racism is thought of largely, and again, these are my views, okay? And so, and they're educated views and they're thought out views, but again, there's a lot of place for discussion around this topic, obviously, and dialogue and learning and growth. Racism is thought of really in two macro areas: individual racism and then racism that might be embedded in systems, systemic racism. So racism, from my standpoint at the individual level, is just the unjust treatment of someone due to the color of their skin or their race. Now, race is a social construct. There's only one race, the human race. There's only one race. But race has been socially constructed, so we talk about many races. But the reality is that there's one race with many ethnicities. And so racism would just be the unjust treatment of someone because of the color of their skin, because of their race, or rather their ethnicities. Another way to think about it would be prejudice and bigotry and discrimination directed towards someone because of the color of their skin or because of their race, or more appropriately, their ethnicity.
Okay. And in considering systemic injustice or systemic racism, what is that?
Okay, so my definition of systemic racism, that's my definition that I use in my scholarship, and this is a definition that I've coined due to my time in the academy and in the peer-reviewed literature and scholarship around this topic would be this. So systemic racism, and I'm going to read it here to go slow with you. Systemic racism is racial prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination embedded in society's norms, customs, ideals, beliefs, and laws, manifested in society's systems, sectors, and institutions to the effect of unfairly advantaging whites and disadvantaging people of color along lines of power, privilege, agency, and resources.
Okay. Now,
you want me to say that again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So systemic racism is racial prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination embedded in society's norms, customs, ideals, beliefs, and laws, manifested in society's systems, sectors, and institutions to the effect of unfairly advantaging whites and disadvantaging people of color along lines of power, privilege, agency, and resources. So you'll notice something that I am not saying that systemic racism is, or that racial discrimination is the sole cause of racial disparities in this country and at the world at large. So people like Ibram Kendi and people that are of his perspective will say that all racial disparities are rooted in racial discrimination. So discrimination equals disparity. That is categorically false. And so disparities may be in play for a lot of reasons, okay? So anybody that says it's systemic racism really is just the disparities between blacks and whites where blacks are disadvantaged, and that disparity is a one-to-one correspondence to discrimination. That's false. If you'll notice in my definition, I am being very specific about the fact of racial prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination being embedded in societal norms, customs, traditions, institutions, and so forth, where people of color are unfairly disadvantaged and whites are unfairly advantaged along lines of privilege, agency, and resources, and so forth.
Now, I want to ask a couple follow-up questions because I'm the layperson here. Okay. When Monique first started talking to me about systemic racism, it took me about 9 months to even figure out what we were talking about. Okay. It was just a completely different, a new concept for me that I had never noticed or given any thought to. And now, since the death of George Floyd, it seems like, everybody's talking about systemic racism, and it's really something that is now part of our cultural vocabulary. And so I'm glad that you gave us a definition there. A couple of things I want to make clear is my understanding about systemic racism is that I, as an individual, might not be racist, but I can participate in a system that has racist outcomes. That was something that was very difficult for me to understand. And maybe you can give us an example, whether past or present, of what that might look like for lay people.
Okay, sure. Let me say this, that if I'm asked the question, do I believe in systemic racism? The answer is yes, as long as it's being defined correctly. And the answer is no, if people are trying to, make a one-to-one correspondence between discrimination and disparity. That's a very flawed perspective, and that has will have tremendous deleterious impact on our society if somehow that becomes the norm in terms of how to define systemic racism. But Krista, you're correct. There's a distinction being made between individual acts of racism and bigotry and prejudice, and then a system that has been created that is somehow perpetuating and reifying disadvantages to people of color because of racial prejudice that is somehow embedded in the system of the, like, let's say, the banking system or an institution like a bank. And so I think the way to think about it is that when we're thinking about systemic racism, we have to think about it from two macro standpoints: de jure systemic racism and de facto systemic racism. De jure systemic racism is legally recognized, codified laws and policies and regulations that are racist. De facto systemic racism is not legally recognized and codified, but it just is. It is racism that is in the system. So when we think about slavery, slavery was an institution that was de jure racism. Slavery became law, and the marginalization, discrimination, and brutality of Black people was codified into law. That was de jure systemic racism.
Would Jim Crow be an example of that type of racism as well?
So absolutely.
Okay.
So from, slaves first came to this part of the world in the mid 1500s, not 1619. In the mid 1500s, they landed in what we now refer to as South Carolina. But slavery, for all practical purposes, in terms of how it's normally thought about in our country, began in 1619, went to 1865. So we have, 250 years roughly of systemic racism. And then from 1865 to 1895, we had Black Code laws in place in the states. And that was de jure, legally recognized and codified systemic racism. And then from 1895 to 1896, the Plessy and Ferguson case that really re-upped Jim Crow and strengthened it. And Jim Crow began in a stronger force in the mid 1890s up to 1965, with the Voting Rights Act and then with the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. And so for that 70 years, yes, that is de jure systemic racism. So in the laws, in the policies, in the regulations of our society, racism is built in. And so let's think about it. I've got a whites only water fountain in 1948. And I'm a white man in 1948. And then there's a colored water fountain 30 feet away. As I go drink water from the whites only water fountain, I am participating and I am complicit in the system of racism, even though in that moment, I am not committing an individual act of bigotry against a Black person standing in front of me. Do you see that distinction?
Yeah, that's helpful. Now, with the Civil Rights Act and other laws that we have passed since then, would you say? Well, first of all, give us some examples of the other type of de facto systemic racism, and then then I'll drill a little deeper there.
Okay, let's just back up a little bit further, because we want to think about the fact that de jure systemic racism was massively pervasive, and this has every impact on a Black family in 2020 America. Okay, so we're gonna connect the dots. But when we think of mass incarceration, now mass incarceration is complex, and I'm not fully with Michelle Alexander relative to mass incarceration, or some of the people that want to say that systemic racism is pervasive and present in our incarceration system at the moment. That is not the position that I have, even though I do think that there is some systemic racism that is in our criminal justice system at the moment, and that has been present for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's never been not present, but I would say that it is certainly less so than it has been historically. And I think some people make disparity too big of a perspective relative to mass incarceration, so they're flawed in their ultimate understanding about how pervasive systemic racism is in our prison systems and in our criminal justice system. But two other areas would be redlining and the redlining and then the GI Bill. Both, redlining and the GI Bill were very sweeping areas of systemic racism. in terms of what redlining ultimately did to brown and black folks, and what the fact of the misapplication and the failure to apply the GI Bill to the 1.2 black veterans coming out of World War II, and only a fraction of them realized the benefits of the GI Bill.
So 1.2 million, I think, is what you mean. And were those
1.2 million? What did I say?
Just 1.2, but
no, 1.2 million veterans. Yeah, coming out of World War II.
So yes. Would that be with redlining and the GI Bill? Is that de facto, or is that the other one, de jure?
Yes, so that would be de jure systemic racism, because again, the redlining policies and the failure to apply the GI Bill was that failure to apply. Like, for instance, the federal government said to the veterans, we're going to give you low interest mortgage loans.
Right.
And we're going to give you low interest loans to start a business or buy a farm. And so the black veteran has the full backing of the federal GI Bill when he shows up at the bank in Raleigh, North Carolina. And then the bank says to him, we're not going to loan you this money because you're black. And so their policies at the banking level were still part of de jure systemic racism, even though that GI Bill was affording benefits ostensibly to black veterans.
So it was like they had the promise of a benefit, but they couldn't cash in the benefit because there were these other rules in the banking industry. Now I'm wondering, did the Equal Opportunity Housing Act, or whatever it's called, did that overturn redlining, or is redlining still a thing, or is it like more informal, technically illegal, but kind of still happening?
Yeah, so redlining started in the 1930s, and it was discontinued officially by the Fair Housing Act, in 1968. Okay, so it was officially discontinued. And so, but the repercussions of essentially a generation and a half of the application of redlining, in the 1930s, we're in the Depression, the housing market is being pressed. And so the federal government starts a program where they're going to assess risk, and they're going to demonstrate that risk by color-coded maps. And so 239 cities in the United States were mapped, and green meant, the areas of the cities were mapped, and the green areas meant best, the blue areas meant still desirable, the yellow areas meant declining, and then the red areas meant hazardous. And so when those maps were drawn, that means in those red areas, there was a lack of resources moving to those areas because banks, insurance companies, hospitals, supermarkets had determined that those areas were financial risk. And at the same time, black folks could not live in white-only neighborhoods. And so they were channeled into those areas, those neighborhoods. And so those neighborhoods were determined to be at risk and redlined. And the way the federal government drew the maps is that they talked with local officials, realtors, mayors, bankers, insurers, and said, what are the worst areas of your town where there's great financial risk? And what motivated the decision to determine that the neighborhoods with black and brown folks are the areas of risk was racism. And how do we know racism was at play? Because there were financial neighborhoods that were all white that had the same financial capability and risk level that another neighborhood that was black had. So we had two neighborhoods, white lower class type neighborhood, black lower class type neighborhood in terms of the financial wherewithal of the citizens and residents in those neighborhoods. Yet the white neighborhood oftentimes would be marked as blue, as still desirable. And then that the neighborhood where black folks were concentrated, it was marked as red, even though the financial wherewithal of those two neighborhoods was basically identical. The risk was basically identical, but because of the racism of the local authorities determining what the map should look like for the federal government, then those neighborhoods got blackballed, so to speak, and redlined. And it's interesting now, 50 years later, that 75% of those same neighborhoods that have been labeled were redlined are still struggling financially, and those that were labeled as blue and green are still doing well. And we still have 85% of black and brown folks in those neighborhoods that things aren't going well, and those other neighborhoods are still predominantly white.
So even though on paper redlining is illegal and we don't do that practice anymore, the impact of that now is still there, because 75% of the people still live in those areas, and the impact, the lasting impact of redlining is still with us. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. And again, with the GI Bill and with redlining, black and brown people were kept from home ownership. That was one of the key things on the ground that was going on. The black vet was forced to only live in certain neighborhoods, and then banks wouldn't make loans for those neighborhoods. So black folks who were capable and credit worthy and should have been given loans by the tens of thousands were not able to purchase loans. And in a society that prioritizes capitalism and has a growing, large, and meaningful middle class, the way to create wealth, the primary way, is through home ownership.
Right.
That equity building enables you to have access as a gateway to other accumulation of wealth and financial resources. And so that stranglehold, that put a stranglehold on those neighborhoods and black and brown folks. And that's why today the typical white family has 8 to 10 times the wealth as a typical black family. And because, so that de facto racist perspective present now is siloed and rooted to what took place under de jure racism.
That's really helpful to just kind of break it down for us step by step. I think
I do have one other example that I think will be
okay. Sure, yeah, we're going to school tonight, so when we're getting a lot of questions on the chat box, but this is great. We're just going to stay here as long as we can, because these are all the questions that we keep getting, and we're very grateful for your expertise. So yeah, just go ahead and bring the next example.
Well, and I'm actually holding back a lot of data, okay? Because I know you've got other things to do tonight, but people can DM me if they want further dialogue. And
you don't have nothing else to do. You can just come on, just bring it on.
Let's just keep going.
And I don't want to be too long-winded. That's another thing that I'm fighting here. But a lot of this, there's a lot of robust content that we really want people to see because of our care for our fellow brown and black brothers and sisters, and then also our fellow human beings. All right, so let's move into de facto racism. All right, so let's take the banking industry. A lot of banks have been around for over 100 years, correct? A lot of banks that are present today were started in the 1800s, okay? I was a banker for 20 years, and so was very involved in banking. My last role, I was a senior vice president, regional director for a mid-regional bank. So I grew up, had a strong career in the financial services and banking sector. And so there was a time in the 1940s and 1950s in banks, in their human resources manuals, in their policies that were established and legally recognized and codified, they had policies where that they would not hire black people. That's part of their policies. It was part of their actual policies, their de jure recognized policies. All right.
So even though it was against maybe the government, they had an internal business practice.
No, I'm talking about during Jim Crow.
Okay,
Been around for 100 years.
All right.
So there was de jure racism under Jim Crow. All right. Legally recognized policies in the banks that say, do not hire black people. We're not going to hire black people. And so that became outlawed when Jim Crow ended in the mid 1960s. So that de jure racism ostensibly is ending. Well, as a banker, I've been to Chamber of Commerce mixers as recent as 2004. And I'm at that Chamber of Commerce mixer with a lot of other bankers and around banks that have been around for 100, 120, 130 years. They no longer have de jure systemic racism on their books. They don't have any policies that say don't hire a commercial banker who's black. Like they used to have things almost that plain. But sitting around at the bar having the mixer, I would bring up conversations like, well, who in your officers at your bank, your official officers and your executive management, who's black? Who's brown? Who's a person of color? And I would run into banks that they did not have a single officer at the bank or executive who was black. And this is 2002, 2003. This is still with us with certain banks. So see what's happened here. There's no de jure systemic racism, but there is a point of fact of de facto systemic racism, because we're looking at the officers and we're looking at the executives and there's no person of color. They're not there. And so the lingering effect, the downstream effect of de jure racism in the institution of this particular bank that I'm talking to this banker about, that is lingering in the form of de facto racism, because they haven't hired a black person to be a commercial banker, to be an officer, to be an executive. They just haven't done it. They haven't hired a Latino person to be in those positions. And do you see how that is de facto systemic racism? It's in that institution, a reality, but yet it's not de jure racism because it's not codified in their human resources manuals. Do you see that distinction?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Now, here's a question. So I talk a lot about this, or I used to talk a lot about this in the realm of theology, and would say, well, why don't we see any brown or black people, especially because I went to Biola, represented in the books? Like, why isn't you trying to tell me there's not one person of color anywhere who's on the up and up theologically that we could read that would represent someone like myself?
Right, because they actually are.
Yes. Yeah. Now, one of the pushbacks that I would get is like, well, there aren't any, we haven't found any, or things like that. There's no one who really truly, holds to sound theology, or we don't want bookshelf diversity just for the sake of diversity. We want sound theology. So what would you say to somebody who's in the banking field, or even like in the theological realm, that would say, well, we just haven't found someone, or, on paper, they don't really look so good, because this is that argument right there. I'm like, no, we don't want diversity just for diversity. Like, don't hire somebody who's a C level, when we definitely want an A level for our organization. But one, what can we do to bring in people of color? And then two, like, what do you say to people who are just like, well, there just is no one?
Right. So you bring up a really good point. And what you're getting to, Monique, is that racial disparity, particularly in 2020, it is in particularly when we're talking about de facto systemic racism, it is hard to isolate a disparity being caused by racism from the standpoint of the racism being monocausal. That the only effect brought to bear to cause the disparity is racism. Coleman Hughes brings this up a lot, that there's so many legitimate causes for disparity, particularly in 2020 America. That wasn't true in 1720 America or 1920 America, but it certainly is, or certainly less true then, and particularly 1720 America. But this is true in 2020 America. Because, for instance, maybe there's not a commercial banker because of meritocracy and competition. That's a person of color, because that person of color just is not a good enough banker, so to speak. And so the disparity is not just maybe the residue of racism that has downstream from de jure systemic racism. Maybe it just has to do with the pool of candidates here. There is not a worthy person of color that's strong enough as a banker to be hired. Okay. And so you'll hear statements like I would hear at the mixers. Well, we haven't found the solid candidate, or our clients our clients are predominantly white, and even our black clients, they don't feel the same trust with a black commercial banker because blacks are not typically commercial bankers. And so that would throw them off. And it's not that we are prejudiced against black people, we're prejudiced against losing business. Mm-hmm. And so we don't want to lose these clients. And so we've got to continue to hire someone who is white. And so what we've got going on there is a mixture. We've got this disparity for a number of factors, including meritocracy, competition, how adept the person is in their skill set, combined with lingering perspectives around the deficiency of a black person being able to do commercial banking. And when we start to think about it in those terms, that's when we start to think, well, blacks don't do that. Blacks don't do commercial banking. And then we can take it a step further. Well, actually, in blackness itself, there's just not high quality people dealing with finances and commercial banking. And so what we've done now is we've slipped into some full-orbed racism at that point. And so to your point with reading theologians, it needs to be said, we need to figure out better who's out here. You need to read more broadly. You need to find high quality theologians and pastors who are persons of color, not because we need their standpoint, positional standpoint voice to tell us what the scriptures say, not because of that, but because we need the diversity of the applications of scripture and the insight. And so we've got to keep in mind that interpretation and meaning biblically is singular. There's one meaning of any text, but there's several appropriate applications of a text. And so we don't need a woman, or we don't need a man, or we don't need a black person or a white person or a brown person or a poor person or a rich person, their lens of their social categories. We don't need that to help us interpret scripture. No, in fact, that will get in the way and ruin the interpretation of scripture. What we need is illumination of the Holy Spirit when it comes to getting to the meaning of a text. But the various applications of a text, people's social locations can benefit their hearers in terms of unpacking certain text, in terms of application. And that's why it's important for our seminaries to be looking for quality persons of color, pastors and theologians that do in fact exist. We got to get outside of a European, American, Canadian, Western, ethnocentric perspective around some of these things and look to the strength of historical theologians in other parts of the world. And so forth.
Amen. I mean, that's what I've been saying for a really long time, that it is about the application.
No, that's not what you've been saying. That is not what you've been saying.
I don't know what to do with this.
Oh, my God.
I have been saying for a long time, no, we don't need diversity for diversity's sake, but we need diversity for the sake of application.
I'm getting out of the way of the lightning.
That's all I'm saying.
It's coming. All right. So we're getting a lot of questions on the chat, and I'm going to go through a few of these before we move on.
Hold on 1 second, because this, sorry.
Hold on.
Hold up.
All right.
This question actually goes directly to what you were just saying.
Okay. And I've got 45 seconds on another de jure, de facto systemic racism, if you want to hear it.
Yes. And then I will ask Vanice. I want to say Hoffman. Vanice Hoffman has a question, and it's directly to this.
Okay, sure. All right. Because some people say that Black people can't be racist. That's not true. We can all be racist. Racism is sin. Any color can be racist, biblically speaking. Some people will say, well, Black people can't be racist because racism is prejudice plus power. Well, that's actually a flawed definition. But let's even go with it. There are a couple of restaurants that I eat at that are Black owned that happen to be a place where the Black owners don't love white folks. They just don't love white folks. It's a known thing. And if you're a white person and you go there, then you're going to get some institutional racism. You're going to be treated differently. You're going to be treated more coldly. Your French fries are going to be less than what they normally would be. You might get one less piece of chicken. You will be treated differently if you're white. And so in that moment, those Black-owned proprietors have institutional power in their restaurant that disenfranchise and marginalize whites. And they do. Now, I go because the food's so good. I mean, it's just the way it is. The food is really good, so I go. But even when I go with a couple of friends of mine who are Black, who understand this about this restaurant, when we order, even if we order the same thing, we laugh to ourselves. I mean, they laugh. They tell me, don't worry, I'm going to hook you up with my fries, because they know I'm going to get less fries. And so in this context of 2020 America, this is a situation where there's institutional power, and the Black proprietors are disenfranchising whites in that moment because they have ownership of that restaurant. They're in the power position. Now, let's not get it twisted. Absolutely, without question. Most of the institutional racism, and that was an example of de facto institutional racism, but let's not get it twisted. Most of the institutional and systemic racism that takes place in this country, the vast majority of it, of course, is where Black folks and brown folks are being disadvantaged and whites are being advantaged. But anyhow, I just thought I would mention that, because a lot of people are approaching this topic and not being nearly nuanced enough about the realities of what can be taking place relative to our society.
But that brings up something that I wanted to say about the definition that you gave earlier. Like, these are things that can impact all people, no matter what your color, even if, by and large, people of color have been those that are impacted. One of the things that I would say, looking at our current moment of society, is that with an increase, I'm beginning to see things that are impacting white people. So yeah, it might start off small, like in a restaurant or a restaurant chain, but then you'll look at universities and the way that students are treated in universities, white versus people of color and things like that, and how insidious it is. But yet we've been ingrained to believe that systemic racism can only go white to Black, or it can only injure people of color. And that's not actually true in my belief. I feel like these issues that are, to me, just deeply rooted in sin impact other humans and have the opportunity to impact humans regardless of your color. Would you agree? Or maybe I'm just off in left field.
Absolutely. When we think of our nation from a hegemonic dominant standpoint, hegemony means power, means dominance. Okay. And so the overarching hegemonic perspective in our country has benefited whites to the disadvantage of people of color. Yes. But in 2020 America, to your point, Monique, there is what I call localized hegemonic power. You might be in a certain situation, a certain setting where the white male is being marginalized. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, in secular social sciences, in graduate programs, okay? You have a local hegemonic pressure to be progressive in your viewpoints, for instance. for instance, being pro-life. I was pro-life. I'm pro-life now, and I represented myself as pro-life when I was in graduate school. That was a minoritized position. That was, a position that progressives were winning the day. And so the localized hegemonic power in my program compelled people who were pro-life to silence. They were worried about speaking up for what they believed. Now, I spoke up for what I believed and was winsome and courteous in that 95% of the time. Every now and then I had to get a little bit stronger, depending on how people were reacting to me. But to your point, the way our society is unfolding today, there is localized hegemonic pressure working counter and at cross purposes and upstream to that overarching hegemonic pressure, where you can see even the old white man, that moniker now is, I see on social media all the time where people are talking about, oh no, he's so-and-so is acting like an old white man. And that is to be a marginalized, position, even though historically white men have been in positions of hegemonic power.
Yeah. But
with cancel culture and with a number of things taking place relative to your livelihood being at variance, that you're correct. The pendulum is, swinging in a different direction depending on what we're talking about. No doubt.
So as Christian leaders, it sounds like one of our tasks, not the only task, but one of our tasks is to make sure that we're not exchanging one form of racism for another form of racism.
Please don't repay evil with evil.
That is a real possibility. And so that's something that we need to be speaking into. But it sounds like another one of our tasks is on the justice side, what we talked about with our friend Thaddeus Williams, is, we want to recognize the long-term impact of redlining, that even though on paper people have the autonomy and the ability to move, they might not have, there's so much setbacks for them. So we need to think about, as Christians, like, what do we do to help those communities with entrepreneurship and job creation and helping people get into home ownership, because those are two big ways of getting into wealth building, multi-generational wealth building. So we need to understand those things.
And how do we bring resources to some of these communities? Because, I can go down to South LA and there's grocery stores and, in some parts you'll find Target, but by and large, you don't find a lot of like big chain grocery stores in a lot of inner cities. Or you might have to travel a way out to get to the store. So it's easier just to go to the liquor store, that small little shop on the corner, which is going to charge you more.
Right.
And won't have the things that you really need. It's more like fast food kind of stuff, junk food kind of stuff, but you'll find a fast food place on every corner. Right. So how are we resourcing people who may be impacted by the long-lasting effects of redlining and things like that?
That's helpful.
Okay, so Miss Hoffman, I'm calling her Miss Hoffman because she said that she ran across something frequently in the 70s, so I think she might be a little older than me. It says, I would love to hear about the hiring of people to promote diversity versus hiring someone with the proper credentials. I ran across this frequently in the 70s, hiring Blacks just to meet the quota versus hiring the best person for the job. I have a personal belief about that. Like, I'm not really for tokenism. Like, don't just hire a person of color just because they're a person of color. Like, if they're not, again, if it's a C-level person versus an A person. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, and so can you clarify the question again in terms of?
Oh, she just wrote in. She sent me a note. She said, thank you. She goes, I think you sort of just answered this, not trading racism against Blacks for racism against whites.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a study, though, that I saw Neil cite once about hiring, since we're talking about that there is a certain disadvantage that people have if their name sounds more ethnic, and that might be a subtle form of racism. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is the case, that there are studies that are done relative to job applications and the response of the companies and corporations to the person's name, and regardless of or distinct from actual skill set and credentials. And some of those studies do indicate a bias against Black and brown or Hispanic, Black, people of color, even Asian names, and biases that reflect hiring that now is advantaging whites and disadvantaging Blacks. And so those studies are out there, and there certainly is some truth to that. I would say that, back to that question where I was going to just ask for a little bit more clarity, I would say that we don't want to do tokenism, like you said, Monique. But giving my banking example, somebody needed to say in 1970 and 1980, hey, yes, our customers only want to deal with white people given the racist perspectives that have permeated our society coming out of slavery and Jim Crow, but we're going to be different. We're going to hire high quality Black people that can do this job, train them well, and then we're going to begin to change our customer base that will incorporate clients who are Black and brown, who are not opposed to working with a Black or brown banker. One of the things that people in power need to do, that are Christians, that are concerned about the marginalization of Black and brown people, is to make those kinds of decisions, because it's just a fact that Black and brown folks today are in a legacy of a deficit of equity along vocational opportunities, educational opportunities, and inherited wealth. And those things still linger. And what Christians in power ought to do is to make that kind of decision. Being the chairman of that bank in 1980 and 70, going, we're not going to have tokenism, but we're going to change the culture of our company. And therefore, we will, in effect, change the culture of our clients. And we will trust that people ultimately want good business and to make money. And then that will, in good business practices and good profit. And that will ultimately override the racism and the attitude of prejudice and bigotry that is still lingering. And so we do need to take those kinds of actions. Another thing that we can talk about after we get to some other questions is ways that we can be meaningfully involved, and to your point, Krista, to actually make an impact in areas where there has been marginalization and disenfranchisement relative to resources in parts of our communities, in parts of our cities. And to, like what you said, Monique, there's even food deserts in some of these lower and under-resourced areas. And so there are ways to change this. But if we're going to be conscientious Christians, we've got to be salt and light in our communities.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we're going to do that and not think about these matters. I mean, I'm involved in praxis and activism as a believer, justice activism that's biblically supported and substantiated. Mm-hmm. But even if we're concerned about woke ideology, which we should be, and even if we're concerned about worldview embracement of critical social theory, which we should, both those things are deleterious. Both those pathways are deleterious to the soul. We have still got to not let that scare us off from being in our communities and even involved in protest and involved in moving systems and institutions for those who are marginalized, not just help ministries, not just benevolent ministries. Those things are good and needed, and we need to continue to do them. But there are ways that we can actually move the systems in our community. And I'm happy to talk at length with anybody that would want to do that. And we can get into some of that now if you'd like to. But
sorry, I just cut Krista off. But this
That's okay. Oh, I'm decentering whiteness over here.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're gonna keep on going. Yes. Keep on keeping on. Now, what would you say to somebody who says, well, because, okay, and this is where this thought is coming from. I feel like when we look at things like the impacts of redlining, you get two schools of thought. So one is everything is the system of redlining, and the people in the community are, in poverty and impacted by drugs and violence and all this because of redlining and because of what, like, the wealth gap and what all that meant. The other school of thought is these people have personal choice. That was 50, 60 years ago. Why are we still talking about redlining? I think you've really brought forth a lot of good information as to exactly how people are still being impacted by redlining, but where does personal choice come into this, or does it not come in at all?
That's a great question. And both those things are true. And this is what we've got to lean on. Without question, that part of those neighborhoods are that way because of redlining and misapplication of the GI Bill, and then also how incarceration was taking place. There was some racism connected to how that was being manifested, certainly, and these things have lingering effects. So there's a sense in which, yes, if we're going to cut off the financial resources going into these neighborhoods, loans can't be made, insurance can't be purchased, the hospitals aren't coming there, supermarkets aren't coming there, businesses can't be started there because they're redlined and financial loans are not going to be made. The businesses that are there can't get working capital loans to continue and to fortify themselves in down economic cycles. So there's a sense in which there's been a causal effect of those racist policies that have helped those neighborhoods become what they've become. And then in addition to that, individuals do things they shouldn't do, and their personal accountability has to be in play here. And so we see situations where, individuals are not keeping their responsibilities. Like, for instance, the issue around single parent homes, for instance, the issues around drug use. I mean, these are choices that are being made, and you can't blame a system in the midst of your egregious personal choices that you're making. And so the smart play is to recognize that both these things are at work. Both these things are at work. And we know from a biblical standpoint that individualism really matters. And so this is part of a full-blown collectivist society that somehow tries to sideline individualism as part of society. That is a flawed way to go. We have got to keep in mind that personal accountability, personal responsibility, individualism matters. And we know that as we stand before God relative to our sin, we're going to deal with the accountability of the sin choices that we have made. And that's what Jesus specifically paid for. And we see Jesus's ministry largely about our personal sin and responsibility. He wasn't dismantling systems of oppression at every turn. No, the bulk of his ministry had to do with, our individual sin, which goes to the embedded principle behind it, that personal responsibility and accountability matters.
Right.
And so it's a both and, Monique, versus an either or.
Yeah, no, I hear that. I think we talk a lot about personal responsibility. I think we're very big on personal responsibility. Like, how are you going to be responsible? What can you do? Even in the midst of, hardship and things like that.
Yeah.
But I've cut you off 9 times now. I am so sorry. I'm going to decenter my whole self. Just all of me, the Haitian, the African American, all of me. I'm decentering.
No, I think that's really important because my understanding of the Christian worldview is this unique combination of both individual responsibility, but also group identity. The idea of being the body of Christ and the idea of walking with one another and confessing our sins to one another and sharing our burdens together. And we're kind of both as Christians, as the body of Christ, but we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ as individuals. Our families don't save us, and so we have to be clear about, what we're saying when we're talking about group identity versus individual responsibility, because both are present in Scripture. But that's very different than what our culture is saying right now about collectivism or tribalism. Those are it's a very different type of conversation. So that was one point I want to make, but I want to go back to something that Pat, you said a few minutes ago, because we got a couple of questions on the chat.
We got more than a couple. But, they are coming through.
Yeah, but I think that one of my issues about social justice that's happening right now is that we seem to be identifying what is unjust mostly just by disparities. Mm-hmm. We're not really engaging in a project of identifying what's unjust by looking in scripture and letting scripture tell us what justice is or what injustice is. What I see happening in like kind of the woke side of Christianity is that they use the word justice. They don't really define it. Then they jump out in the culture with what the culture is telling us is just or unjust, who the oppressed and marginalized are. And then the conversation just sort of proceeds from there. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that at all, or if I'm just way off on that.
No, because I agree. It feels very conflated. So now the culture tells me that this people group, or however they identify, are now either marginalized or experiencing unjust treatment, but those things biblically don't align. And so now I need to jump on board with this idea of, inclusion or justice for this group. And that may not align with my biblical worldview. I agree with you. I'm with you. I'm following.
I want to hear what Pat says.
I was just trying to help. Excuse me.
Well, I think it's you bring up a very great point. We've got to have biblical definitions and biblical categories. And so what critical social theory labels as an injustice is not necessarily an injustice. We have to start with a biblical epistemology. We have to let that truth drive us. And so the truth of biblical epistemology. Epistemology is, how do we know what is true? How do we understand what is justified knowledge over mere opinion or guess? And so that's what epistemology is about. And we have to have our epistemology rooted in a biblical understanding of justice, oppression, marginalization, and so forth. And this is why I said at the beginning that if we know the truth of the Bible, that can protect us against error. And so our failure to really understand what the Bible says thoroughly, then that begins to allow us to adopt definitions of oppression and injustice that actually are not biblical. And this is the seduction and the problem, part of the problems of critical theory and critical social theory, is that it is a worldview. So it's answering questions relative to metaphysics and meaning with answers that are different than what the Bible actually teaches. And so the critical social theory also talks about an interlocking system of oppression. And so you have to think about oppression from the standpoint of how it's being fully defined by critical social theory, or you can't legitimately embrace any of it. And so this means that there's a conflation, for instance, between how to think about race and ethnicity, and then how to think about sexual ethics. And so biblically, we recognize that we're to think about race and ethnicity and fighting against racism from a biblical standpoint that is often consistent at times when we get past this notion of just disparity equals discrimination. But we can see that dovetailing with certain aspects of justice that we see in society. But when it comes to a sexual ethic relative to what the Bible teaches in its full-blown, orbed, beautiful, doctrine, that obviously runs counter to how critical social theory is manifesting how to think about sexual ethics. And right. So Christians have to be discerning about this. Now, that obviously means we need to be loving to all communities. And this is part of the problem. Christians have failed to love people across difference. And so we've lost the ability to say, I love you and I care for you deeply, but the lifestyle choices that you're making here are less than God's ideal for you. And in fact, in certain capacities, they're unrighteous. And we've lost the ability to have that conversation where we can communicate that we do love someone deeply, but then we can tell them and talk to them about areas where they're at variance with God's law and how God thinks about these matters. And so to protect us from these kind of conflations and not buying into wholesale critical theory from a worldview standpoint, like you said, Krista, we've got to have biblical definitions of what oppression and privilege are. And we also don't even know the difference between rights and privileges. We don't even know the difference between a human right and then an earned privilege when it comes to a host of these categories.
I think that, though, this issue of disparities, I want to bring out a little bit more, because when I look at disparities, this is how our culture is telling us, this is how we identify what's just and unjust, is I look at the numbers, and if things are weighted in a certain way toward a certain group of a certain ethnic group, then that is an unjust situation, or it might be a just situation if it's, for white people. It's very convoluted. But when I think about, like, I'm a very short person. I'm only 5 feet tall. Monique's a lot taller than me.
I'm 5'9". Yes.
And I would never be able to play in the NBA. I'm a short white woman. Okay, so I'm being kind of discriminated against between, and being able to play in the NBA. Is that a disparity? Is that an injustice? Because if I'm going to define an injustice by a disparity, by the world's definition, and I hope this isn't a stupid question, but this is a question that I've thought about, is because I think this idea that we're going to define an injustice by a disparity leads you down some really weird alleys.
Right. I think your point is absolutely on target, Krista. Again, it goes back to this idea that disparities really now in 2020 are not monocausal relative to racism. There's agency, there's opportunity in ways that are expansive compared to 1820 and 1920. And so the disparities that we see are caused by multiple factors, and many that are right and noble and have nothing to do with racism. They have to do with, like, meritocracy, for instance. The NBA, the Los Angeles Lakers, they're not going to recruit you to be their center because your height is what it is. Now, they're not going to recruit me either, partly for my height and other factors. But you're right, there is a disparity. One of the things that I remind people is that NBA players, okay, NBA players, 75% of NBA players are black men. Well, they represent 6% of the population. So they're overrepresented. The NBA black men are overrepresented as players in the NBA tenfold compared to their population sizes. Now you need population sizes. You have to go by who's actually applying or attempting to be part of this situation, like the NBA. So it's more nuanced than just population sizes. But to your point, we don't think that because whites only make up 18%, white men only make up 18% of the NBA, that somehow they're being discriminated against because of that disparity.
Yeah.
And because we're recognizing that there are other factors that are in play. And this is more and more germane in 2020. I have a colleague who will tell me, and he's a black gentleman, he will tell me that things are just as bad now as they were in 1930 and as they were in 1830. And he'll say that with a straight face. And that's just absurd. And he says that because he looks at things that he just looks at bald disparities, and he's failing to recognize, to think about these things in a much more nuanced way, given the reality that disparities now are caused by many, many factors, some that have nothing to do with racism. And this is more pronounced. This is more of a reality than what it used to be historically.
Well, we're going to do a couple more questions in the chat. Boy, there's a lot of action happening in the chat.
Yes.
One of our viewers wants to know if
this
is Facebook, but it was a long time ago.
Okay.
I don't know.
YouTube. This question?
Or YouTube, yeah.
From our friend Rachel.
What's your stance, if you have one, on reparations for those who were generationally affected by redlining, such as in the GI Bill example. Like, do you have any thoughts about that from a biblical point of view?
Yes, and that is a big statement. And I've tried to keep this streamlined, but I fear I've been talking too much as it is. And I will say we did truncate the GI Bill and redlining too much. There's a lot more involved, so please catch up with me and let's talk about it further to get into a more robust sense of it. But the answer one of the things we have to think about is this, that you are guilty of the sin that you've committed. You're not guilty of other people's sins. And so modern day whites are not guilty of historic white sins. And so when we think about the philosophical perspectives that may undergird whether we're going to have reparations or not, we have to begin with that someone is only guilty of the sin that they've actually committed. And so even when we see sins in the Bible where you have, say, Daniel repenting on behalf of Israel, he's also talking about ongoing sins that are taking place, and he's using language of us and we. But we cannot repent for sins that we did not actually commit. So any kind of reparations that may be in play can't be rooted in the white guilt of modern whites if they did not take part in the actual disenfranchisement of people of color historically. So I've never been a slave owner, so I don't need forgiveness of that sin. I've never supported Jim Crow. I don't need forgiveness of that sin. I've never supported redlining, so I don't need to be forgiven of that sin. So therefore, I don't need to make reparations because I have some guilt or complicit accountability to those things in the past. Now, with that said, I do think that the United States, as a collective citizens, could decide that, well, in the history of this country, Black folks, brown folks have been dramatically marginalized and disenfranchised and cut off from resources. So maybe we need to think about a way to have some reparations for those communities that have been most affected, that are largely the communities that have had high numbers of Black and brown folks. Then maybe we should institute a tax or something where monies could be put into areas of our society that have been hurt the most relative to the things that we're talking about. Now, I'm not here stating to you that I am pro reparations because I'm not looking at a reparation plan to make a decision about, but I am pro us thinking about and contemplating whether we ought to have reparations. But again, it can't be rooted in false epistemology. It can't be rooted in accountability and guilt that is non-existent. But other societies have done this, where they've acknowledged groups that have been radically brutalized and disenfranchised, and made offered financial incentives to those groups. Some people would argue that affirmative action programs have been a type of reparations historically, that there's even been some of that already happening. And so from my standpoint, I'm pro thinking about how we could do reparations as long as we don't root it in false thinking as to why we're doing it. Does that make sense?
Yes, you mentioned affirmative action as a form of reparation.
Well, I'm saying that I think that's a flawed way to think about it. What I'm saying is that affirmative action programs, some people contextualize that as a form of or a type of reparation. That's what I'm saying.
I think I have considered that to be like a form of a reparation, of trying to like right the wrong that was done. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know where I stand with reparations and that idea. I think, well, actually I do. I feel like if we're taxing the people who had no part of redlining, who had no, part of slavery and things like that, to be able to give that to an area that, may have been disproportionately impacted by redlining, or people who were impacted by slavery. I don't know. I think that in some way has to be like a form of theft, because these people, like you said, they didn't have anything to do with it. There's no need for them to repent or pay for that. So maybe help me think through this a little bit more, because and maybe, I don't know, maybe your jury's still out too, like mine is, on a lot of this topic. But I think, to your point of putting resources into a community that may have been impacted, and maybe that doesn't look like a tax or money that goes directly to the individual, but to an area.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, I can speak to what you're saying here.
But then, yes, I want you to. But then I was also going to say, like, what I've seen in my 20 years of social service is that in putting money into an area without giving individuals the proper education that they need, and the proper, like, tangible resources that they need to be able to replicate, like something that is long lasting, to me, it ends up being like a waste of funds anyway. I don't know. Like, that's a hard one, but you've made me think about, how this could possibly be done. I just wonder if it's theft, if we're going to tax white people to be able to give to areas that were impacted by redlining, if the white people had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that the tax needs to be on white people.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that we can't do reparations operating from the standpoint of white guilt or white complicity, where there isn't true white guilt or white complicity. Mm-hmm. But the Bible, in a number of places, including Luke 12, speaks of those who have much, who have large resources, need to be open-handed. And so those citizens that have strong resources, there is a biblical principle that those resources are to be held loosely and shared with those who have limited resources. So the reparations wouldn't track along skin color. It would track along where the groups of people who have resources are. Now we're taking tax money and putting it in areas where there is under-resourced and limited resources. And it will just so happen that the concentration of Black and brown folks in those places will be benefiting from that financial move. And so
I think I'm the reparation skeptic here. I'm just not optimistic in government programs. I think that if that was something that the church wanted to speak into, which is how I see Jesus's words about having open-handedness about money, that it's an expression of our holiness, it's an expression of our gratitude toward God, that I could understand. I guess I'm just the skeptic of government, large-scale government investment into communities. It hasn't worked very well so far. I'm kind of a skeptic that it's very effective. I'm much more of an advocate of free market solutions and private solutions, and I think it's something churches could maybe be more effective in if we got a clear biblical vision about it.
Yeah.
But I'm not an advocate of tax-based reparations. I guess I just can't get behind that from a biblical point of view. I can't get there. So,
but I would say where you already are is that you live in a non-theocratic society that has a tax base and taxes that go to all kinds of different programs.
Right.
And that you do that willingly because of, in its most ideal sense, the collective decisions of the community, the nation that you are in, that's determined that taxes will be done this way. So we're highly frustrated when it goes to things that are unrighteous, certainly. But my only point is that reparations should be thought of from the standpoint of our country, from the standpoint is if we as citizens of the United States were to decide collectively that this nation has hurt in a pronounced way people of color, and that has left places in our society that are grossly under-resourced and hurting, it's not unreasonable for us to consider as a nation flipping the script and attempting to do something about that, not from the position of guilt and complicity, like I've already said, but from the position of the biblical standpoint of that much is required of us that have been given much. And so we are to be, very open with our resources and hold on to those things loosely. And so there is a place for our country to figure out how to manifest that and implement that. And to your point, Krista, we should already be doing that as a church, and we should already be doing that as a private, in our private institutions. And the church fails in that, and the church is doing that on some level. But my point is, it's not unreasonable for us as citizens of this nation to consider a reparations plan. I can imagine that many could be presented to me that I would say, no, that's unrighteous. That works against biblical principle. It's outside of the jurisdiction of ideas that cascade from biblical understanding. But I do think it's possible, and I'm open to consider, possible reparation plans.
How would you respond to people that might say that, we've paid, a lot already to underserved communities? We already pay a lot of taxes to those underserved communities. We had the creation of the entire welfare program under LBJ, and we continue to invent more and more programs nearly every day. It seems like, how would you address that? I'm curious, what would be different than what we're already doing?
Yeah, all that has to be considered. Okay. I mean, if you look into those, if we look in a very detailed way into various welfare programs, some of those programs have reified the disparities that we're talking about in their failure. And so there's even been kind of what appeared to be a benefit and help to people of color when in fact it created greater separation. And so, yes, those programs, and then also those programs have made an impact in those communities to some extent. I'm not an economist, and and so I do think that, in fact, I'm a soft libertarian when it comes to my personal economics. And so, but with that said, I'm just saying that it's not unreasonable to consider reparations plans, that people that just go anathema to reparations and we're not even going to consider how that could be relative to our country as a nation making these decisions. I think that's short-sighted given the fact that we've had 250 years of slavery, 30 years of black code laws, and 70 years of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
And that was a national standpoint. So maybe we as a nation, not the church, not private organizations, but we as a collective community and nation should maybe consider reparations.
Well, we'll have the economist on next week, so we'll see what he has to say.
So again, I don't want you to think that I'm pushing for reparations. I'm not. I'm just trying to be balanced. That given what has in fact providentially happened with our country, it's not unreasonable to consider reparations. And to what you said something, Monique, earlier, yes, it's possible that you can give money to people who will waste it, and it will be to their hurt.
Well,
sure.
I just think that as a case manager and as a program manager developing programs and things like that, it's, one of the things that's frustrating is that to offer resource just because, or to throw money at something just because there is a presumed need, to me doesn't fix the problem. And having conversation of, well, what is the real problem? Because for some people, it could be that they were impacted by redlining, or it could be that, their grandparents really worked their way through this whole redlining situation, and they themselves have made horrible choices. And that's what I ran across a lot was, these people are making personal choices, and that is more of a grotesque impact on their current situation. And, I guess my heart is that if we're going to do something, and I'm all for doing something, it needs to be done with a lot of education, a lot of prayer. I don't have a lot of hope in a government coming in and saying, hey, this is what we want to put in place. Even, nonprofit organizations, and I've worked in nonprofit for the majority of my career, I don't see them, if they're accepting public money, having a lot of movement or say in exactly what they get to do, what outcomes they're looking for. Right. Because there's so many pieces to the puzzle. But I do believe that, regarding this whole conversation of how can Christians get involved, I think that's something that we definitely need to be talking about, and doing so from a place of, how can I hold this family? How can I bring them up to a higher level of accountability and responsibility for their life? That's just what I was thinking.
I'm going to start the wrap because...
Okay, well, let me say quickly.
All right.
My position is I'm a soft libertarian when it comes to how to think about economics. So certainly we don't need to be just throwing money at situations and thinking that will fix it. And so, but what I'm saying is the reality of that, at the ground level doesn't negate us thinking about in principle how we might think about reparations from a national standpoint, given the history of our country. And so the reality of people wasting or programs that are wasteful doesn't change the fact that from an ideological standpoint, we need to think about that principle of shoring up some places in our nation where there have been deficits because of our nation's actions. Mm-hmm. And then also before we leave, I hope we get to, I know we're running out of time, but how how you can be involved in moving systems. If we need to table that for another time, I have a lot of ideas because I'm involved myself in how to get involved in your communities and work with social systems to make lives better and have an impact on the social systems versus just help ministries and so forth. So maybe we're out of time, but maybe we could do that.
We got a question in very similar or along those lines. And the question was, are there any biblical examples addressing systemic injustices? Like, where can we see any of that biblically? And then, so I think that kind of leads into your point of what can we do to address systemic injustice?
Yeah, so that is a really long conversation, and it's gonna be too long-winded.
Maybe you and I can do a video, or the three of us, we can all get together and release that.
Yeah, because we actually do see certain things relative to theocratic Israel, but that is not a complete application, obviously, to a non-theocratic society in the U.S. There are large biblical principles that go to benevolence, that go to caring for orphans and widows. And if you're going to care for orphans and widows, that's got to be
people want us to keep going. So just go.
I mean, if we're going to care about orphans and widows, that's going to be manifested at the individual level, at the community level, and at the national level. That care for orphans and widows, or for those who are marginalized and disenfranchised, even for the foreigner, we see that the care for the foreigner resonate in the scriptures. That's got to be applied at a practical level, from a micro standpoint, individually, from a meso standpoint in our communities and cities, and at a macro standpoint from our nation. It will have teeth to it. It will have actions. It will have policies. It will have legs to it. It will be, a skeleton that will be filled in with all kinds of things. And so if you're going to do that, well, that's going to necessitate thinking about programs, policies, and it's going to be driven from that higher principle that God is very interested in his creation that has been marginalized and that is outside the status quo. His concern God's concern for the poor is pronounced throughout Scripture. So how am I to take that concern as a follower of Christ and walk that out practically? Because it's got to be north of platitudes. It's got to be north of, yeah, I care for the poor. Well, do I really? And if I do really, then that means my pocketbook's going to have to be affected. I'm going to have to feel some sacrifice. And so that's going to, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of what that's going to look like at both the individual, community, and national levels.
Okay, so unpack that a little bit. People are like, y'all keep going. As long as you good, I'm good. I'm just going to readjust. So if you unpack that a little bit and you say, well, our pocketbooks need to hurt a little bit. We need to feel some of this impact. And actually, to me, that's a rubber meets the road mentality. What does that look like? Like, what can some of that look like?
Yeah. So, well, again, you have people that while I on a lay level have some definite knowledge, understanding around economics because of just my interest. We have people, scholars, and we have people in society that are dedicated to economics and how government programs might be manifested and might work themselves out at the practical level. And so I would be hesitant to get into the weeds around some of that. My point is just that at a practical level, we've got to be making some kinds of engagement at the system level. And so I'm trying to honor that these things are complex and not speak out of turn, because people do that all the time. They talk like they know about something when they don't really know anything about it. And I'm one to not do that. With that said, there are practical ways that you as an individual and as a Christian can begin to impact systems in your community. For instance, one of the things that I do is that I work with homeless shelters in my community. And what I do in those shelters is I meet with residents in the shelter and I dialogue and we get into conversation. So how are you here? How many days have you been here? Why are you still here? Why aren't you in permanent housing? Who is your caseworker? Are your disability services out of whack and you don't have any funding to get into permanent housing? So have those kind of conversations. And then that leads to talking to social services and the caseworker of the person that I'm talking to. And if they don't have one, help them get a caseworker. And then talk to landlords that are into subsidized housing to help move this individual in front of me into permanent housing and affect that system of social services, where that individual is trapped in just staying in a homeless shelter. And so sometimes that means I'm having to call the caseworker and meet with the caseworker and say, okay, why hasn't John here moved into permanent housing? Well, he won't turn in his disability paperwork because we have to have those monies coming in because the landlord has got to see that he can make his payments. Excuse me. And so I get involved in helping that take place. And excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. So I need to get some water. My voice is going away as I'm speaking here. Sorry.
Next week, we're going to have an economist on the show, and we'll continue this conversation. And also, we can always have Pat back. This has been really helpful. I really appreciate how you've walked us through so many details step by step, Pat. And I think that, I want to let our viewers know that we have more shows planned in the future about community renewal programs and exploring those with experts. And we're doing a lot of things behind the scenes here to engage people that are actually doing justice issues, I think, from a biblical point of view, and really trying to engage both theologically and, at the systems level and helping people. So we're going to continue this. Don't feel like this is the end of the conversation. This is only the beginning of a lot of shows and a lot of content that Monique and I have planned as we continue to investigate and work through all of these issues. So that's okay.
And your voice is tired. It's like your voice is like, what are you doing to me? What's going on?
That's all right.
No, but it's all good. Uncle Dr. Pat, thank you so much.
Thanks for coming and just walking us through everything.
Yes.
It's been really helpful.
I hope it was meaningful.
It was. Thank you so much for just being here and being in it with us and giving us this lesson. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Catch you later.
Take care.
All right.
All
bye.
right.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we're going to quickly do the wrap here because it is late on the East Coast. So we're going to now have the tweet of the week. All right, no intro. So Allie Beth Stuckey, who is like a big podcaster, tweeted this week about Jonathan Isaac. And for those of you who don't know Jonathan Isaac, we have a picture here of him standing up. He's not that one, that one. He's on the Orlando Magic. And so here's him with all his teammates. He was the one lone guy standing up, not wearing the Black Lives Matter shirt, not kneeling during the national anthem. And here he is. This young man is 22 years old and a minister of the gospel. And you can go on YouTube and see his grilling from the reporters after this on why he did this. But going back to Allie Beth Stuckey's tweet here, Jonathan Isaac's two-step solution to standing up to the mob. This is exactly what we've been saying. Say no. Just say no. And share the gospel. Christians, take notes. Maybe you can comment on this a little bit.
Oh.
Come on now.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Like at some point you just have to say no. You just got to disagree with the rhetoric of the mob, and I think it's either Exodus or Deuteronomy. It says, do not run with the mob, and so
don't follow the mob.
Don't follow the mob
in doing wrong. Yeah.
And so I think we have some very clear definitions in scripture of what is right and what is wrong and what we should follow and what we shouldn't follow. And I believe that standing with Black Lives Matter as an organization is, something that we are as Christians. I can't personally get behind it. I feel much like he does. And
he said in the press conference, he said, I just can't get on board with Black Lives Matter as an organization because they're not really for all Black lives. Yeah. And he was very diplomatic about it. There was another picture this week of a player on the Giants.
I was going to say some more stuff. But
that's okay. I'm centering whiteness now.
Let's decenter because you had asked me. I wasn't saying nothing. I was responding to a comment.
So anyways, but
yeah, it to me, it's about, what are we going to stand for? And knowing that we can't, sometimes we're going to have to stand alone, and I know you're about to show this next picture, but again, it's what are we going to stand for? And are we willing to stand alone?
Yeah. And I think that it's a question that we've been asking is what sacrifices are people willing to make? Mm-hmm. And are we going to think through our position? And we're not saying like we condemn anyone who does kneel or anything like that. It's just people have to think through what they're doing and what the Lord wants them to do. And this young man just thought, the Lord didn't want him to kneel and didn't want him to wear that Black Lives Matter shirt. And so he was standing alone. And we have to be thinking about what price we're willing to pay.
Yeah. And not just, are you willing to stand alone, but are you willing to stand if you lose your house? Are you willing to stand if you lose your job? He makes a ton of money in the NBA. At this point, you have to decide now. It's like, am I willing to risk my tons of money to be able to stand with my God? And so, yeah, I just say kudos to him. That's awesome.
Yeah. Very good. All right. I guess that ends the show.
The marathon, but it was good. Uncle Dr. Pat was in the house. Ooh, so excited.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And happy Saturday and good night.
Night.
There's nothing